question of credibility.
So on the OBR, there were lots of announcements made during COVID on furlough that had no OBR forecast, that involved greater fiscal expenditure than the mini budget. So I think it's interesting that media organisations choose to target the mini budget as not having an OBR forecast, but don't mention when it's about spending. And I do think that reveals a mindset, which is spending is good, and we'll always be relaxed about that, but cutting taxes is somehow a sort of a countercultural thing to do. And I think that's reflected in the media. I think it's reflected in the polity more broadly. So there was no reason we had to do an OBR forecast. The OBR officially forecast twice a year around major fiscal events. The plan was to do a fiscal event later in the autumn, which would also have the spending plans in it. But what we needed to do, because the energy situation was so desperate, and we also wanted to reverse the national insurance rise and send a signal to companies about corporation tax, which we had a very short lead time on. That's why we did the mini budget when we did. But as I've said, it was no bigger than those other fiscal events that had no OBR forecast. So we didn't think it was an issue not to have an OBR forecast. The OBR should be there to present the entire spending plans in the round. And on this issue of what happened as a result of the mini budget, I mean, another point I would make is I don't think organisations like the BBC did a brilliant job of actually analysing the LDI crisis and what happened there. I don't think there was an effective critique of the Bank of England. And it really goes back to this point about institutions and politicians ending up having all of the responsibility, but not necessarily the power. And I don't think the media, who seem to absolutely love gossip about politics, are particularly great at analysing the role of institutions and what they do. And you notice if ever there's an official from one of these organisations, they get a much easier ride in a BBC interview than a politician would. So I'll wait to see that happen, Faisal. And as I said in my speech, interest rates were going to go up anyway. I think the real failure was not to tell people years and years ago that these interest rates were artificially low. That was the problem. We gave people an expectation that cheap money would go on forever, and then when the interest rates went up, there was a problem. But this really leads me nicely on to Mark Carney. And I talked about the 25-year economic consensus. Well, part of that has been the central banks. And I do think they have played an important role in pumping the system full of money, keeping interest rates artificially low, essentially enabling this excessive government spending to take place. And I'm afraid there's quite a lot of finger-pointing going on from people like Mark Carney because they don't want to admit their culpability or the culpability of their central banking associates in this. And I again think, of course, politicians should be held accountable and responsible for what we do, but when there are people with significant power, I don't feel that the same questions are necessarily asked about them. And, Mark Carney is part of the 25-year economic consensus that has led to low growth across the Western world. And, no doubt he's defensive about that. On the subject of, it was Lucy's question, wasn't it, about MPs? I think there are different, and this is why I highlighted the 150 Conservative MPs that have written to the Prime Minister on the subject of not wanting to change climate change regulation. Now, I believe the way we are implementing those climate change regulations is adding to the cost of living. And if there's anything we should be doing at the moment, it's reducing costs for households. Now, I'm an unashamed supporter of fracking because I know that energy prices in the US are half what they are in the UK because they've fully exploited their shale reserves. And if we did the same in the UK, We'd be able to have much cheaper energy, and that would reduce the pressure on households. It would help make our businesses more competitive. And that is not happening because of a very fixed view of how we deliver our climate change, targets. So this is an issue that the Conservative Parliamentary Party doesn't agree on. But then that's the fundamental problem. There are people like me who think we should focus on getting growth going and improving the cost of living for people around the country. That's certainly what I hear on the doorstep from my constituents about what they're bothered about, but others do not agree with that. And that is why I'm making the speech today, because I want to convince my party colleagues of that point. I mean, on credibility, without wishing to sort of bang on about the same points I've been making, is very difficult if the government of the day has an economic policy that clearly leading economic institutions in the UK and indeed internationally don't necessarily agree with. And during the time of the mini-budget was attacked by the IMF on inequality grounds. It was attacked by President Biden, and it was also not wholly supported, I think it's fair to say, by various UK institutions. So that is difficult, of course, for international credibility. But I had a choice, and the Chancellor had a choice. We either tried to do something to fix the problem, or we went along with the orthodoxy and did nothing. That was the choice facing us, and I don't regret the choice I made. And if people say, well, you've put the case back for free markets, what I think I have been able to do, and I'm going to be saying more about this in my book, which is coming out in April. I think you can already pre-order it. But I'll be saying more about this in my book, is that this has given me a real insight into why it's so difficult for governments to deliver a smaller state or tax cuts. It's not just a problem that there isn't enough political agreement. We actually have real institutional issues with delivering these things. And that is what I'm going to be exploring further.
Okay, I'll take another round from the room. Can we go to Kitty on the aisle just here in front of you, the lady there? And then we'll go to
Kitty Donaldson from Bloomberg. In your speech, you've blamed a host of people for the problems that you encountered in government. Just to go back to Faisal's question, is there no sense of humility or apology you want to make to British people whose mortgage rates have gone up? Secondly, will you do Rishi Sunak a political favour and withdraw your honours resignation list?
So just on this point about interest rates and mortgage rates, the point I made earlier, Kitty, is that those rates were going up anyway. I think the political failure was to tell people that the rates have been artificially too low too long. And in fact, the rates have gone higher since the mini-budget than they were during the time of the mini-budget. And this has not been a point that's been reflected by the media at all. I mean, I admit that the communication wasn't as good as I would want it to be. I mean, we were in a fairly unusual situation of a leadership election, a period of a hiatus. Very sadly, the late Queen died, so there were difficult circumstances. But of course, I would have wished things to turn out differently. But what I tend to find in these types of questions I get from the media is people aren't criticising the policy, but I think underlying what everybody who criticise the methodology say is they don't really like the policy. The tax cuts we were introducing were not major tax cuts. They would have made a fairly marginal difference, in fact, to the level of the deficit. But what they were is about showing a new direction for Britain. And that's what I wanted to do.
Take another, so the gentleman with the glasses. Yep.
Carl Dinnan from ITV News. Whether or not it's entirely fair to say, as the opposition parties do, that you practically single-handedly crashed the economy, it's harder to argue that you didn't trash the Conservative Party's record for economic competence when you look at the polls ever since you were in office. Do you think that by reminding everyone of your policies and what happened, you're being helpful to the Prime Minister?
Okay, and we'll go to the gentleman in the row in front. Yeah.
Thanks. Andy Bell, 5 News. Isn't it the case that in your broad prescription for what needs to happen next, talking about cutting taxes and restraining benefits, you have to accept that the rich will take home more money and the poor will have less? Are you comfortable if that is really your prescription for growth?
Okay. And the gentleman behind with the glasses. Just there, yeah.
Hi, Chris Dorrell from City AM. Do you think the Bank of England should be independent? And if not, what methods would you suggest to increase the scrutiny of it?
Okay, so we've got 3 there. So the evidence of what you say to what's happened to the polls. Andy had a question about whether your policies would lead to increased inequality, and then a question about the Bank of England's independence.
I mean, I do want to challenge this phrase, crash the economy. The fact is that since I left office, both mortgage rates and gilt rates have gone higher than they were at the time of the mini-budget. So I just think you are repeating a line to take from the Labour Party when you say that. As for the Conservative polls, I'm a great believer in actually listening to what people are saying. And I go canvassing regularly in my constituency. I hear what people are saying on the doorstep. And what people are frustrated about in Britain is not, the ticker tape on Sky News. What they're frustrated about is costs have gone up and their income hasn't gone up. And that has been the case for some time. And that's why I believe people voted for change, to change the way things worked in this country. And that's why they voted for Boris back in 2019. And I think the issue we've got in the polls is we haven't done enough to deliver that change. So I didn't support getting rid of Boris. And I think it was a mistake by the Conservative Party. If you look at the polls, that had a major effect. But delivering change is what's important to people. When people go to an election, they think, am I better off than I was? Does this party have a plan for the future? That's the basis on what they vote. And I think, look, I'm a great fan of our free press in Britain, so I don't want to sound like I'm just media bashing, but I think the media could do more to analyse the real issues. Why is it that people's incomes haven't gone up? Why is it that we have economic stagnation? Why is it that our energy bills are twice what they are in the US? I think that would be helpful rather than reporting everything as a Conservative Party soap opera, which I'm not particularly interested in taking part in answer to Lucy's question. This thing about the character of rich and poor. So take the 45p tax rate. Now, the CEBR analysis shows that over 5 years, we actually bring in money from getting rid of that tax rate. So everybody in Britain is better off by the fact that no one any longer has to pay that 45p tax rate. And I believe that whatever the headlines generated, people vote on the basis of how am me and my family going to do? Do we think the country is going in the right direction? And as Conservatives, we have to be prepared to stand up for that, because on your logic, Andy, we'd have 90% tax rate on the rich because it would be popular. It might be popular, but it's not actually going to deliver the prosperity that we need as a country. On the subject of the Bank of England, I said during the leadership election campaign that what I would like to see is the mandate improved. And it's certainly the case that the Bank of England have not focused enough on the money supply. And that has been an absolutely key issue. But I do think there is a case for looking at the governance across our institutions and making sure it works. Because the fact is, the situation last autumn was the Bank of England governor was in a very, very powerful position with respect to me.
Great. Gentleman on the aisle there. Yep.
Thank you. I'm obviously an economic and political journalist, but I'm also a former fund manager and market practitioner.
Would you like to give us your name as well?
Yeah, my name's Liam Halligan.
Thank you.
And so I talk to lots of currency dealers, bond traders, about what's really happening in financial markets in the way many other journalists don't, I would suggest. And when I talk to them about what happened a year ago, many of them talk about the Bank of England in a way that isn't reflected in mainstream debate in this country. Not only did the Bank of England not put up interest rates as decisively as many expected just before your mini-budget, therefore putting sterling under pressure, the Bank of England also chose just a few days before your mini-budget to implement some quantitative tightening, putting bonds back into the market, putting gilt markets under pressure. And then after you'd left, and we had business as usual, as you've called it, Sunak and Hunt, then the Bank of England reversed that and re-engaged in quantitative easing, so supporting the gilts market in a way which, to your successors, was politically beneficial. Could you spell out a bit more your thinking about the role of the Bank of England during this decisive period? Because this is a very live issue. This is not one for historians.
Great. We'll just take a couple more. So the gentleman second in on that. Yep.
Thank you. Giles Wynne, former Treasury advisor. You've spoken about some of the forces that you believe were against you last year, and you've spoken about some of the things that wouldn't have made a difference, for example, greater pitch rolling. You also spoke about how communications could have been better. Is there anything that you yourself would do differently if you had that time again?
And we'll just go to Gemma.
Gemma Tetlow, Chief Economist here at the Institute for Government. I just wanted to dig a bit more into the point you're making about the OBR and the forecasts and how that affects the way that policymaking happens. So, I mean, as I'm sure you're aware that the OBR forecasts are not completely static. They do take account of dynamic impacts of policy, and that's an important part of the forecasting process. And you saw that, for example, most recently in the March budget, where the changes to some policies on the labour supply side, the OBR did then judge on the basis of the evidence they had. They thought that would increase labour supply, and that was factored into the forecasts. So I just wanted to understand a bit more about what your concern is about the way that that forecasting process works and how that interacted with your policies last year. So is it, because I guess the OBR look for evidence that they think policies will shift the dial on the supply side, and if they see that, they factor that into the forecast. So is it that you think they were ignoring evidence that there would be important supply side impacts of those policies over the next 5 years? Do we need better evidence base on those types of policies? Is there a need for more evidence to support that? Or is your concern also that the 5-year forecast horizon itself is too short to really properly capture supply side impacts, and should we extend that horizon to support better long-term supply side policymaking?
Great. So we have got three there. Liam's question about the role played by the Bank of England last year. Giles, you might do differently, or you laughed. And Gemma's questions about the OBR's dynamic forecasting.
So just on the role of the Bank of England, I mean, it's important to recognise that I wasn't the Chancellor. I wasn't dealing directly with the Bank of England. That was Kwasi Kwarteng. So I probably got less exposure to understanding what exactly was happening. But certainly on the LDIs, there clearly wasn't enough information. So the fact that we were completely blindsided by LDIs, I literally hadn't heard of what an LDI was until the following Monday, which was quite a large part of what happened in the market. And also the failure to raise interest rates early enough, I think, was a major factor. But I do think we need to look at it. And I think there needs to be honest assessment by the commentariat, the media, policy think tanks about exactly what happened in the markets and why it happened. And I think there's been a lot of finger pointing, particularly at me, but also others. But I don't think the level of analysis has been particularly fantastic. What would I do differently? I mean, that's a question and a half. I mean, preparing my premiership 2 years earlier would probably be the first thing I'd do differently. The fact is, I didn't know it was going to happen. I thought Boris would carry on being the leader. I was on Indonesia at a G20 foreign ministers meeting when it kicked off. And it clearly isn't, the best time to launch a major change in economic policy 2 years before an election and after, not having that time to sort of build the infrastructure and the preparation. So, but, I consciously knew that at the time. And I thought, should I go for this? Because I do think we need a change in economic direction, but I knew it was going to be difficult to win the leadership election, but also implement it. Or do I not go for it? And I decided to go for it because I thought it needed to be done. Obviously, if I'd known about the LDIs, we would have done things differently. If we'd known the sort of fragility of the markets, we would have done things differently. These kind of questions are quite difficult because a lot of the way I did things was basically the way I am and my character. And if you're saying, could you be a different person who's maybe slightly more slick on the media and, well, that's just me. That's what I am. So it's more probably about preparation, I think, and the key thing. On the OBR, so I think both of the things that you said. So yes, they do, or they say they do dynamic analysis. I don't think it's dynamic enough. And I think the impact of regulation is understated, and the impact of tax cuts is understated, and the benefits of public spending is overstated. So that would be my critique of the way the Treasury stroke OBR thinks about the world. And I also think that by removing the OBR from the Treasury, you remove the direct discussions between ministers and officials, and that creates a very sort of strange and artificial situation where sort of forecasts are exchanged back and forward. I don't think it makes for best policy making at all. I don't think it works effectively. But I also agree with you that the time horizon is far too short. And that it's embedded something that I think was already there, but focusing on 5 years. And a lot of these changes we're talking about, like really changing the housing supply or really things like changes to pensions are very, very long term, and they're not well captured. And this goes back to, I think Harold Wilson tried to fix this problem when he created the Department of Economic Affairs, but did he successfully create it? It didn't last for long anyway. Very long. But the Treasury is an accounting department, and it's also meant to be an economics department, and the accounting section always has the whip hand. That's.
Okay, I've got one question to take from online. Take Ben here.
From BBC Newsnight. I want to zero in on this question of how the Bank of England performed, but in the wake of the mini-budget. There is a view among some of your supporters that the bank effectively called time on your premiership by demanding a full reversal, by linking your policies to its support for the bond market. Do you agree with that view, or would you like to disassociate yourself from it?
Okay, we'll go to Chris here.
Chris Smythe from The Times. I mean, you've made clear that your frustration with the current government and suggested perhaps it's been captured by the anti-growth coalition, if not actively part of it. Given that, do you think it might actually be helpful for the Conservatives to have a spell in opposition so that they could have this debate about where they're going in the future, the importance of free markets? And if you don't think that, perhaps you'd come back to Kitty's question about whether it might be helpful to the current Prime Minister to withdraw your resignation honours.
And I'm going to take the top-ranked question online from Dr. Alexis Brassey of the University of Cambridge, who asks, the ultimate assessment of your fiscal strategy was the bond market. They can't be wrong, they just determine the price of gilts. What would you have done differently to have convinced bond traders you could have delivered?
So on the role of the Bank of England, it was certainly the case that there was pressure on me and the government to reverse our decisions on taxes. And I believe that reversal was counterproductive. So I believe that raising corporation tax to 25% was the wrong decision. But I was essentially forced to do that on pain of a market meltdown. Now, exactly where that was coming from is harder to put a finger on, but certainly it is the case that that is the reason that the policies got reversed. I mean, I said in my speech that I think a Labour government would be a disaster for Britain, that Starmer and Reeves are talking about Bidenomics, they're talking about even more public spending, a so-called industrial strategy that really is just a green version of what went on in the 70s. It was a complete disaster for our country. So I don't want the Labour Party in government. I do want the Conservative Party, and this is not just down to the government, this is about Conservative MPs as well. I do want the Conservative Party to be the party of small government and free markets, and to make that case, and to not be scared of the climate change activists and the Extinction Rebellions and the anti-capitalists and the sort of woke diversity brigade. We can't be scared of those people. And we have to listen to what voters are actually telling us about what they want. So that my plea is to the Conservative Party, we need to advocate those policies. That's what I tried to change. On this question of the bond markets, and I do point out again that gilt rates have been higher since I left office than they were for the entire time during the mini budget. So I don't think it's just an issue about what we sought to do. But these markets are very, very influenced by politics, and they're very influenced by economic institutions. So if they sense that policies don't have the support of the Conservative Party and that they can't be got through Parliament, or they sense that the Bank of England isn't happy with the policies, then that creates a problem in the markets. And I think what I didn't realise before I got into number 10 is just the sheer level of power that an organisation like the OBR has. Because what happened is, after the immediate aftermath of the whole LDI crisis, there was then a leak by the OBR that there was a £70 billion hole in the budget. And that is in essence what forced us to reverse the decision on corporation tax. So that is a leak from a public body, which subsequently turned out to be wrong. That 70 billion was way overestimated, but that had an impact on the markets. So this is why it's difficult to put a finger on it, but I think the basic problem we have is there is a consensus at the moment about the level of tax, the level of spending, how big the government has to be, and there is a sense of groupthink around that consensus. And trying to break that consensus, I certainly didn't succeed last year. Trying to break that consensus is difficult, but I believe unless we do break it, unless we do change, this country is headed for continual stagnation. That's my fear.
Have you got time for one last round of questions?
Sure.
Yep. Okay. So there is a lady on the far side over here.
Hello, I'm Sarah Gazdari, and I'm a prospective candidate for the next general election. Liz, you talking about pressure from political and economical organizations, and you're talking about how complicated it is for people like us to stand the next generation, to stand in the next general election. And regardless of what the Conservative Party is doing now by putting out their local candidates, possibly instead of the good candidates, what would you advise to someone like me who's got a life, who's been campaigning forever for the last 10 years or more within the country? Why would I do that? Why would I put myself forward at this point?
Peter, then on the aisle.
Hi, sorry, can you see me? Peter Walker from the Guardian. You ended your speech by saying the country has to acknowledge the problems it's got. Is it possible you've perhaps not acknowledged everything that went wrong in your time in power? One of the things that I did was that when you were in your 49 days in office and after that, I spoke to a lot of your fellow Conservative MPs who, even some who agreed with your economic policies, said time and time again your government couldn't even get the basics right. The night that precipitated the downfall of the government was a failure to whip on an opposition day motion, which is a completely bog standard thing for a government to do. Do you think you've properly faced up to that and the kind of errors that you made, beyond whatever the economic policy was?
Final question, this gentleman here, who's been trying very hard.
Thank you very much. You spoke, Liz, about raising the retirement age. Oh, it's Henry Riley from LBC. About raising the retirement age. I wondered on the pensions triple lock if you felt it was sustainable in the long term, and will you be going to the Conservative Party conference next month?
Okay, so why this lady should continue to efforts, whether you sufficiently acknowledge problems of your government, and the triple lock to finish us off with.
Your country needs you. That's why. I mean, we do need good people in politics, and we need people to apply to be politicians. We need people who believe in things to be in politics. I think that's incredibly important. So I encourage everybody in this room to apply to be an MP and to put themselves forward, because we are in a difficult situation as a country, and we need that talent on our benches. On this thing about things that went wrong, I mean, I am writing a book about this, which we'll be able to read, Peter, coming out next year, which will go to a blow-by-blow account. But what I don't want to do is sort of point fingers and say, there's been all kinds of reports, which I don't like to hear about, particularly about exactly what went on in Number 10, exactly what arguments there would be. Of course, it was a very difficult circumstance, and lots of people made lots of mistakes. There's no doubt about that. But I will, in the fullness of time, explain all that in my book. On this question about pensions, so what I don't want to do is see current pensioners penalised who are retired. We can't leave them in the lurch. But over the longer term, we definitely need to raise the retirement age. And we also need to look at how to deliver pensions better, because I don't think the current system works as well as it should do. And clearly the sustainability is a huge problem. And we also need, on the demographic front, and this is why I talked about housing and the cost of childcare, we need an environment that's better for families. So we don't have a demographic problem in 30 or 40 years' time. And so it's as much about making life cheaper and easier for families as it is about sorting our pensions problem. And I just don't see how it's justifiable that our energy bills in the UK are twice what they are in the United States, because we're insisting on a rigid interpretation of climate change legislation. That is actively making it difficult for people to have a family, not to mention all the planning restrictions around being able to get on the housing ladder. Yes, I will be at conference. I will be at conference. And I'll be saying more at conference as well.
Well, I think we've run over, but I think there were many questions answered, so I think it was worth doing that. Thank you very much for joining us. It's really good to hear your reflections.